Aryans. At least one people moved across the kaleidoscope of the steppes at this time toward the east and the rising sun. Tall men with blue or gray eyes and reddish hair, with long heads. They knew how to cultivate the soil, and they fought with long straight swords. They were the racial cousins of the Scythians. One branch of them got as far as the Gobi, and the Chinese christened them the Yueqi. Or is that Yuichi? They were the Aryans, Iranians. About these Aryans, authorities have disputed hotly. They've been called Indo-Europeans and the Great White Race. Some historians in present-day Germany have bestowed on them the ancient emblem of the swastika, but we know little about them. Even the place of their origin is disputed. Their birthland may have been the steppes of Russia. Now, 12,000 years ago in America they were using the swastika, but this is a people that goes back further than that, so it is certain that they became nomads and eventually horse archers, like the other denizens of Central Asia. Whether they were the ones who taught the Eastern nomads to ride horses to advantage, or whether the Easterners taught them, we do not know now. Probably these Western Aryans, who had lived for a long time in the plains, made use of their horses before the Asiatic peoples who were emerging from the forest belt and a primitive hunting economy just then. At last, the early Chinese, who had to reason to observe and to fear both of them, seemed to think so, but it is clear that the Asiatics were more skilled with bows, and it was not long before the Eastern Ortis broke the power of the Yuichi, who migrated closest to their homeland. In their long wanderings, these blue-eyed and warlike men left behind them great grave mounds scattered over the steppes. On these mounds, they placed stone figures, a little larger than life size. These stone babas, or stone women, as the Russian called them later, all face the east, all stand in the same attitude with blank eyes toward the rising sun. And they have mystified archaeologists ever since. But these Yuichi, these blue-eyed devils who spoke the Aryan speech, struck a spark across the savage tribes of the steppes, a fresh spark of purpose and intelligence, falling into smoldering embers. They were dominant conquerors, inclined to rule where they conquered. They gave, as it were, a new purpose to the Asiatic tribes, and they left physical traces of their passing. Blue eyes and reddish hair, tall bodies among the steppe dwellers of Asia. We find such traces in the rock temples of Menasha, where the figures of tall men with European heads and light eyes are painted on the wall frescoes. The outer world began to feel almost at once the spark of Aryan mentality. Kindred in the wastelands, leaders appeared among the horse nomads to direct them in a mass towards the outer civilization, the Great Wall. This civilization was no longer the gift of the great rivers. Irrigation had spread water through the lowlands. Wheeled vehicles carried merchandise from settlement to settlement. Ships felt their way along the shores of the oceans. Looms were at work. Glass and porcelain found their way into the channels of trade. Increasing trade created wealth in the new merchant class and a demand for luxuries among the rich. Caravans penetrated from India to Greece to exchange incense and amber and woven silk for iron and gold. The walls of the metropolitan centers rose higher to protect their wealth and their growing population of owners and slaves. The steppe dwellers had not shared in this increasing culture. They remained as before, isolated, until they began to find their way out of the steppes under their new leaders. The first to appear were Huns, called in the beginning Huingnu by the Chinese. Their chieftains, Khagans, guided them along the easiest road to cultivated lands, from their homeland near Lake Baikal toward the North Gate, along the southeast corridor out of the steppes. And now, to close this pathway, the Chinese emperors built the Great Wall across the hills where their cultivated land met the prairies of the nomads. For a while, this fortress line of 21 centuries ago kept back the people that some call barbarians. It served to turn them toward the west. Here, another road was open to them, and only one. It followed the grass of the prairies just below the northern forests. It crossed the Mongolian plateau to the passes of the Altai, following the rivers of mid-Asia, and coming out of the heights into the immense level steppes of the Kyrgyz, threading through the low slopes of the Urals to the grasslands of southern Russia. So, Persian race to Slavic race transition, right? Thence, it led on directly to the Hungarian plain. No actual road, of course, existed. It was the natural corridor of grass, grazing for the herds. It passed for some 4,000 miles through the wilderness, where only nomads could maintain themselves. It might be called the road of the barbarians. So you got the Slavic on one side as, was that Magug? Or the Mongols, are they the Magug, and the other is the Gog, but either way, they're both the Sakas, the Scythians. And over it, the nomads went west. They started the long trek without knowing what would be at the end of it. For 15 centuries, this trek went on. Something was happening in the steppes of Asia. The tribes, pent up with natural barriers, struggled among themselves for mastery. This struggle, wolf-like, knew no mercy. There could not be two rulers of the steppes. When a Khagan of the Huns became strong enough to seize the fertile grasslands where the herds could move from summer to winter pastures, the weaker tribes fled with their families and herds to another region. There is one sun in the sky, the proverb ran, and one Khagan on earth. At times, usually for no more than a generation, the overlord of the steppes was powerful and farsighted enough to combine the turbulent masses into a brief empire. We are aware of shadowy and gigantic figures that ruled for a few years from the forests of Manchuria to the heights of Mid-Asia. Seldom could such a conqueror bequeath his power to a son. Strife would break out again among the nomad masses, and the grazing lands would fall to new owners. But the steppe dwellers had discovered that when they were united under a chieftain strong enough to rule them, they could invade the outer world successfully. With the regularity of human tides, masses of the horse nomads moved westward, in turn driving the original owners of the land before them. So the Huns drove the Yuetchi on to crush the descendants of the Scythians in the west. There was no turn in the tide. For a moment, a generation or so, the farthest outpost of civilized Rome almost touched hands with the westernmost garrison of the Chinese, then ruled by the Han dynasty until a new influx of horsemen from the steppes swept across these frontiers of civilization. Rome itself succumbed to the invasion of Teutonic and Gothic peoples, but these in turn were fleeing from the approach of the Huns, moving westward along the grassland. For a generation, Attila, a leader with keen political sense, who had learned much from the Romans, formed an empire of people in the west. Deft and remorseless as he was, Attila created only the semblance of a government. It could not withstand the pressure of new migrations out of the east. Two-footed beasts. Ammius Marcellus wrote of the Hunnic invaders at the end of the 4th century, small and beardless, and seemingly chained to their horses, from which they take their meat and drink. This is the Common Era, right? They even sleep leaning on the necks of their mounts. Never do they cultivate a field or touch a plow. They leave no houses. Their life is as one perpetual wandering. They are small men afoot, but in the saddle they appear gigantic. The hunters of the steppes had discovered the plains of Eastern Europe, a milder and better land, where men were too weak to defend the soil. The road out of the east, their road where the stone babas stood guard over the burial mounds, had become a thoroughfare. Over the steppes, new hordes pressed with their wagons. They were moving toward the sun. Out of the land of the ice entities, they were fleeing from stronger masses. Beyond the horizon, at their heels, instinct stronger than reason drove them on. Their wanderings had only one purpose: to find and hold safe grazing land, to survive in this tumult of Volker Wanderungen. Their homeland, the high prairies around Lake Baikal in southern Siberia, had become a breeding ground of peoples moving westward with the measured, unthinking force of a human avalanche. Like Scandinavia, it spewed out human masses escaping from the blind forces of nature. During the centuries after Attila, vague rumors spread through Western Europe. Then, in the throes of the Dark Ages and in the process of conversion to Christianity, these invaders out of the unknown East, the rumors said, were the harbingers of Antichrist, the precursors of those who had come to reap the last dreadful harvest. For ages, they had been pent up behind the barriers of Gog and Magog. Now they were emerging. Well, they were what people called Gog and Magog. Had not the learned St. Jerome prophesied that in the day of Antichrist a race, polluted and unwashed, using neither wine nor salt nor wheat, would emerge from the land of Gog and Magog, bringing disaster with it. It seemed to the Western Europeans, our ancestors, that this prophecy was in a fair way to be realized. Well, some prophecies are realized multiple times. Some are not really prophecies, just, informed predictions, informed statements of what was will be again, the human tides and the walls. These migratory masses emerging from the steppes crushed opposition with the savagery of thinking animals. After the Huns came the Avars and Bulgars, like the Scythians of 1,000 years before that existed on horseback moving with their herds. Their women bore children on the march, and no man could name the place of his birth. These barbarians, a Western historian complains, all resemble each other, but they resemble no one else. Well, if you pay attention, there's at least 19 groups that you can say, yeah, very distinctive traits that make them, basically one race versus another, but most people are mixed races. Their impact telescoped the inhabitants of the Eastern and Middle Europe, and scattered broadcast the seeds of modern Europe. The Eastern Slavs were driven back toward the Dnieper, the Dnieper, and the Danube. On that river, the Avars pitched their wagon ring encampments, sheltering their supplies and treasures, while their Kagan Bayan measured the strength of civilization around him. The name of Bayan is pure Mongol, and his Avars were of Mongol descent. At this time, from about 600 of the Common Era, three forces protected Western civilization such as it was: the vigor of the Franks and Germans, the fortifications of the Byzantine Empire, the survival of Rome and Constantinople, and the unifying force of Christianity. Well, then why did it have so many kingdoms? In 626, the wave of Avars broke and rolled back at the walls of the imperial city, Constantinople. In 1805, 626 and 805 of the Vulgar era, the remnants of them submitted to Charlemagne's Franks and were baptized. But already the Bulgars were moving in from the steppes to this western front. 6 years later, Krum, the Bulgar chieftain, made himself a drinking cup out of the skull of a Byzantine emperor who had stood in his way. Some of the Bulgars chose to remain inside the steppes by a wide river that was named after them, the Volga. Others, penetrating what is now the Balkans, harassed the Byzantines until the kaleidoscope of peoples changed again. This time, the Magyars, the milk drinkers, who were later called the Hungarians, emerged from the east. They were guided by a purpose more definite than other Asiatics. They spoke a language akin to Finnish, and their chieftains were of a Turkic aristocracy. For the first time, Western Europe had to defend itself against the keen intelligence of the steppe Turks, and during the next generations, it had little success in doing so. In 924, the Magyars wiped out the last descendant of the great Charles. Well, last official descendant maybe, but the Byzantines were driven into the into the triple walls of Constantinople. It seemed as if the days of Attila had returned. The solid Germans broke the strength of the Magyars. The Hungarian king Vike was converted into Saint Stephen, and those indomitable horsemen retired to the high Hungarian plain. That circumstance proved important later on. The Hungarians now formed with the warlike Slavs a barrier in the east of Europe against fresh migrations from Asia, barely in time because the Byzantines, in spite of their wealth, their engineering skill, and their invention of flame-throwing weapons, were becoming decadent. They were no more than the ghosts of Constantinople's Rome, haunting the imperial city and the sea. It was the year 1000 of the Bulgar, when the superstitious souls in the West believed their Christian world might end. It did not end, but it hung precariously in the balance, while a new striking force mustered in the east. For a long time, other nomads had been making their way out of High Asia on foot, forest dwellers who made paths through the northern taiga, never emerging into the grasslands. Skin-clad hunters and fishers, some of them reindeer keepers, men who kept peaceably to the snows. Those who found their way westward were the Lapps and the Finns. Others pushed to the east and crossed ice-fringed waters in their open canoes, carrying with them the carved images of animal totems, cared for by their shamans, their medicine men. They crossed the strait now called Bering and settled out of harm's way in Northern America, becoming the ancestors of the so-called North American Indians. No one paid any attention to them. China's yellow earth, as the black earth of the Russian steppes had drawn the nomads into the west, China's fertile yellow earth drew them south and east. Now there was migration across the Atlantic. Kind of, up and down, sort of the same way. And it seems that happened before the Bering Land Bridge. China's yellow earth, as the black earth of the Russian steppes had drawn the nomads into the west, China's fertile yellow earth drew them south and east. The Great Wall had failed as a barrier long since. The early emperors had built it long enough and high enough to be invulnerable to the Hunnic tribes, but they forgot to watch it. The barbarians learned to break through where it was not defended. And there was a particular wall that, in the 1200s also, there was like an earthquake kind of too that made it passable. Then began a movement as regular as the tides of the oceans through the southeast corridor out of the steppes. When the Chinese city-states became degenerate or divided by long war, the horse nomads would break in to domineer for a few generations over the Yellow Earth region of the Shanxi and the north. These barbarians, a Chinese relates, did not number more than a fifth of the inhabitants of our prefectures. Their strength lay in their independence. Now, again, I wouldn't say that people are barbarians merely because they're of a different race of our tribal type or from a different region or they speak a different language. This is just how people spoke back then. So after tasting the luxury of fertile land where the rich grain grew and the silkworm was bred, the nomads would be merged into the increasing mass of the Chinese. Their inroads brought a fresh lifeblood into the Chinese race. This conquest and assimilation went on without change in the north. It seldom penetrated south of the Yellow River and never beyond the Yangtze. So to the nomads, the fertile region behind the Great Wall became a promised land. At the same time, they grew increasingly aware of the great figure of the Chinese emperor, Son of Heaven, so-called, who held all authority in his hands. In spite of the upheavals they caused, they remained in awe of the sublimated man on the dragon throne. He was, in effect, their ultimate lord, a perpetual viceroy of heaven. And at this time, the Son of Heaven had become a splendid personality, remote from the sight of the steppe dwellers. Down in the south of China, the Tang dynasty reigned with victorious imperialism, surrounded by a shield of armies, yet the occupants of the dragon throne were idealists who gave force and direction of life. Within the barriers of the celestial empire, they surrounded themselves with the grace of Buddhist art, delighting in sculptures of the human form. Even the small clay figurines left in their tombs were human and graceful. In their realistic moods, the Tang monarchs built roads for pilgrims, stored up grain against years of famine. They sent ambassadors to Indian kings, and their watchtowers stretched far into the west beyond the desert's sands. To such benevolent patricians as these, the northern people gave little concern. They knew the nearest of them as the Teotihu, the strong, or the Turks, and also as slaves, because before the Turks had become horsemen, they'd worked iron and dug the earth for forgotten emperors. Now, these Turks wandered in tents, struggling to break through the northern barriers. Beyond them, the Tang rulers knew hunters were emerging from the far northern forest belt, hunters of wild game whose dwellings were hauled about on wagons, who were called Mongols or the Everlasting. And beyond them, crossing the line of the Amur River, a still more savage people who still clung to snowshoes and reindeer. The Tungus are pig people, so the Tang observers christened them. It was only natural in such circumstances that when the first Turkish clans began to migrate out of the steppes, they should turn away from the strong armies of the Tang into the west. And the emperors on horseback is where we'll start next time. And by extension, I guess you could say, into the Teutonic people and the Chinese, but even without the extension, are people really paying attention to the Gog and Magog? How they might at some point be able to change the response to global politics? Is there going to be a spiritual change as a result of them, or of what they're, practicing, or perhaps a response to what they end up doing? It's certainly a force that has popped up again and again for thousands of years. Maybe there has to be some sort of change in society, technologically, some disaster that takes away technology, and then we're gonna know about these people again in that way.